Hi, everyone. Welcome to SimiTree's webinar. We're really excited to have you here today. We're going to give everybody just a minute to get into the webinar, get their audio working and logged in properly. While you're waiting, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the question and answer. We will try and get to everybody's questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. If we don't get to your question today during the webinar, we will follow up with an email and a blog post with answers to all your questions. I will be pasting the handout into the chat for you so that you can follow along and see how we're going. So with that, I'm Missy Gilliland, the Director of Learning and Development here at SimiTree, and we're really glad you could join us. We've brought together some of the best experts in the business to talk to us about building a winning team in healthcare. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Missy, and welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here today. I've got a couple of great colleagues on with me today. I'm going to have them introduce themselves as well. I'm Eric Scharber, Managing Principal here at SimiTree. My role here at SimiTree is overseeing our talent solutions, which is executive search, interim leadership, some advisory services around talent, trying to help all of our providers and clients out with the challenges that we see every day with regards to workforce. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Stacy and let you introduce yourself, Stacy.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending where you're calling in from. I'm Stacy Olinger, the founder and CEO of stacyolinger.com. My first experience in home care was working as a home health aide in Anchorage, Alaska, where I went through nursing school. So I've had firsthand experience for home care, and I think that sealed my love for home care. I spent the last 2.5 decades in community and also large academic medical centers, continuing to advance the future of healthcare at home, and most recently started my own venture because I'm absolutely passionate about being in the place where the future of healthcare is, which is home, and helping to support the human side in the element. I 100% believe that technology and what we're doing together in the workforce can and will allow us to do more differently, not just do more with less. And I am so excited to be with all of you today.
Thanks, Stacy. Wayne?
Yeah, hi, I'm Wayne Regan. I'm the Managing Director of Interim Leadership for SimiTree. I started my post-acute career as president of a multi-pronged operation where we had home health, hospice, private duty, palliative care, and then helped grow the largest hospice in the Northeast, where we did an exit. We were private equity owned, did an exit to Amedisys, where I stayed on with Amedisys and helped run 90 locations in the Northeast, $350 million operation. And I've been with SimiTree now for almost 9 years. So as Stacy said, maybe 2.5 decades. I don't want to look at it as decades, but it's been a while since I've been in the industry. And I'm probably going to be the quietest guy in this group today, believe it or not. And if you know me, that's going to be very rare. So I think it's going to be a fun afternoon talking to you.
That's Eric? Great. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Stacy. So yeah, good group, guys. We're going to kind of run through some state of the workforce type stats and just slides real quick, and then we're going to get into a conversation. So this is going to be fast and furious, meant to just sort of tee up this conversation. And then we'll jump into some conversation. I want to spend a lot of time with Stacy based on her experience through the years. I found this little slide, this little graphic a while back, and it's Gallup's organizational effectiveness framework. And I just liked it, and I hated it all at the same time. And I'll tell you why. I'm sorry. At its core, if you look at this, of an organization is its purpose. It's the why you're here. What are you doing? What do you want to accomplish, right? And in order to go out there and sort of fulfill that core, if you will, you've got to have a good strategy and a good culture in place. And that's great. But in order to kind of operationalize all of it, it's that outer ring that does it. And so what I like about this is that people make up 50% of that outer ring, 50% of the operationalization of getting to the strategy, culture, and purpose. Structures and processes being the other 50%. What I don't like about it is that only 50% of it is made up with people, right? Like in my opinion, it's probably about 3/4 about your people and about 1/4 about your structures and your processes. You can have the greatest plans in the world, the best initiatives, all great ideas. If you don't have the right people on your team heading in the right direction, all rowing together, it doesn't matter, right? So it's all about our talent, which is what I kind of like to focus on. And then as you think about sort of where we're at as a society, when you're thinking about, and this says nursing shortage, replace that word with workforce shortage, right? This is across all spaces, whether you're going to the gas station or you're going in the hospital, right? There's a huge worker shortage out there. And here's just a couple neat slides that I think sort of kind of cemented in your brain as to why we're going through this. This is a fertility rate over the last long time, right? Last 50 plus years. And you can see throughout the world, obviously fertility rates are going way down, right? It used to be anywhere from 5 to 7 babies per household, and now it's going down to usually less than 2. This is another interesting one, though. It talks about life expectancy, and exact opposites happening through the years, right? The last many, well, this goes back hundreds of years, but many decades, it's just consistently going up. We're living longer. So we're doing two things. We're having less babies to be the workforce of the future, and we're getting really good at not dying. And so this creates a worker shortage that's going to be here for a long time. And I think it's really important that we wrap our brain around the fact that this isn't a short-term issue we're dealing with. And so there's a few stats here that I think are interesting that, again, you could just wrap your brain around. We all know healthcare is the fastest growing segment of our economy. Of the 30 fastest growing occupations, 18 of them are in healthcare. That third bullet point, I think, is really interesting because home healthcare services, which is home health, hospice, all types of home and community-based care, it's the #1 fastest growing segment of the industry of the U.S. economy in terms of employment growth. And so, again, this is going to continue. However you feel now about your challenges to find and keep good talent, it's not going to change. Oftentimes folks think, oh, it got a little bit weird because of COVID. This isn't a COVID thing. Based on those slides I just shared with you with regards to birth rates and life expectancy, this is an issue that we're all going to have to deal with for a long time to come. And so the purpose of this conversation today is to help you understand a little bit about some strategies that can make you that employer of choice and sort of the winner when it comes to the whole, talent race, if you will. One last slide, and we'll get into the conversation. I think the generational aspect of our workforce is something we all need to be paying attention to. Oftentimes, when you think about culture and employee development, we're thinking of it from a mentality of maybe Generation X and baby boomers. And the reality is that by 2025, 75% of our workforce will be millennials. You've got Generation Z coming right behind it. The baby boomers and Generation X are a thing of the past almost. And they're looking for something much different. And the way their development, what gets them excited, how you engage them. And so as we're thinking about the conversation today, I'll ping, Wayne and Stacy and share as well. How do you talk to this generation of workforce? Because if you could do that well, you could be one of the winners going forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see here. Missy, how do I got to stop share. It's pretty simple. There we go. And let's get into some conversations. And Stacy, I want to start with you. You spent a long time, and Stacy was very modest in her 1-minute description of what she's done. She's been in healthcare a long time. Many folks know the good things that she's done in this industry and worked with some big organizations that had lots of challenges when it comes to workforce. What have you heard, on the streets from, I'm interested, two things. One, like kind of what's the frontline staff saying these days, the clinicians that are out there doing the work, and also what's your management team, the leadership of organizations, what's their feel about where things are at? Because I feel like everybody's pulled in 1,000 different directions at this point. I'm curious what, frontline, what you're hearing.
Yeah, I think from the front line, there is definitely a sentiment that they love the work. I think one thing that sets both hospice and home health apart is that you don't go into this business because it's just a paycheck. You really love the connection and the impact that you're making one-on-one in the communities that you are around and serving. And so there's this dynamic of, I love the work that I do. It feeds my soul, but it's also killing me. And the burden of either whether it be documentation or patient load or shortages on the team or always having to flex up, always being called, can you pick up an extra patient? Can you work this weekend? Is exhausting. And I think a common element that I'm also seeing between the frontline leaders, but also the executive leaders, is that there's a little bit of an element that there's a little bit of loss of hope. There's strategies and engagement strategies and small things that are being done. And I don't want to minimize those things that are being done on a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis to really help to support the well-being of teams. But there isn't, as Eric, I think you show, like there isn't any end. There isn't any end point. It's not just, I can just get through flu season. And then I'll stop having so many admissions this weekend. It's not just, I think there's that element of it that I think leaders really need to pay attention to. How can we reground with the why and help to put in real strategies that work so that there is actually that tangible movement towards that hope that right now just seems to be out of reach.
Interesting. And Wayne, obviously, as Wayne mentioned, he leads our interim management team. So Wayne's got dozens and dozens of executives and mid-level leaders in the field doing interim work. But the interesting thing is he gets a feel for what it's like across a number of organizations out there in the industry across the US. What are you hearing from your team as far as what they're seeing when it comes to kind of these frontline staff and what they're feeling and experiencing?
Yeah, typically the folks that are on my team go into organizations where there's times of duress, times of stress, times of need. So what they're seeing is a talent range that is really good to, I don't know why we put that person in the role. And so they're doing a lot of talent assessment that goes on, because most organizations are at this point where they got to fill those roles. They got to put bodies in the roles. Just like Stacy said, they're trying to get as many folks taken care of as they can because the need is out there. So it's the lack of support that we're seeing that's out there. So they've got to step in and really roll up their sleeves. So they're doing multiple engagements, multiple roles, multiple things, and that it really is seeing a lot of burnout, as Stacy mentioned earlier. We're seeing a lot of folks that are just saying, I'm getting out of this. I'm going to go do something a little different. So it's stressful, I think, for folks that are out there right now.
And Stacy, follow up. So when you think about the leaders, so the folks that maybe reported into you, or those layers or two down, and for everybody that's kind of watching this, so we're thinking about our management staff that is managing these frontline clinicians who are so stressed. What is it that they're looking for from leadership in the way of support? Like, are they saying anything in particular that they're really clamoring for?
Yeah, I would say, so, I had, in my role as a C-suite executive, I had both, vice president, director, manager levels reporting to me. And I think where with any team, that stickiness or sense of community is absolutely important. One of the things that I think I've heard through the pandemic that helped me the most is that burnout isn't the lack of self-care. It's the absence of support. And so if I don't feel like it's safe to speak up, to say, I'm not doing okay today, or I'm overwhelmed, or I need help, and the leader doesn't hear that, or doesn't respect that, or doesn't creatively come along and problem solve, not that you have to just be somebody who lets everybody come into their office and, say their problems every day, like actively work towards problems, but actively listen, hear, and validate, like allow people to be seen and heard, I think is super important. I think it's also for leaders, one of the things that they can do is actually demonstrate their own resiliency and communicate in ways that allow them to, again, create that connection. So a leader that is bulletproof or just drives her results, that doesn't show the human element, creates a disconnect between their teams. And in times of crisis or times of burnout or overwhelm, not enough staff, too many patients, or challenges with getting cash in the door, they really actually need that sense of, here's the plan, here's where we're going, here's the why, and here's how we're going to support each other. And here's what I'm, thinking about, what's keeping me up at night, what's keeping you up at night. Here's what I'm doing to help keep myself resilient, and setting in those boundaries for yourself as an executive leader, because then you'll give permission to your teams to be able to do the same. And so the old adage is still there. You have to model the way. You can't just talk the talk for your teams. You have to model it. And so as an executive leader, and to those levels below, that is one of the most key things that you can do. If you're a leader on this call and that you're in the middle, I think it's important to recognize how you can then help to model that for your teams. So even your frontline staff, but also how can you articulate what is the help that you need? It's not helpful to say to your executive leader, I'm overwhelmed, I don't know what to do today. Like, can you be more specific, right? Can you work towards problem solving? And I think that really helps the teams create stickiness and helps us support each other in the midst of crisis.
This is totally off script, but you mentioned, if you're in the middle and you're having some problems and you have to reach out to the executive leadership to talk about it, you're right. You don't just complain about what's wrong, maybe bring solutions. But have you had situations where, or do you have any advice to the person who gets the pushback, right? There is an issue. They don't have enough bandwidth. They're trying to get that message across to executive leadership, but they just don't want to hear it. Any advice you could share with someone who's in those shoes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I think you always want to first look at what's within your span of control. So if you're coming together with, an issue that's maybe outside of your span of control, is there something that you can do, a pain point that's within your span of control that you can either ask for resources for or ask for other support around you to help you do that. I think it's, again, looking at from the perspective as it's not all or nothing. So is there some incremental step? Is there something that, again, you can then move forward with? I think that's also helpful. And offering to be part of the solution. It's really hard for the executive leader when they get something that's like, I'm hands off, you just take this. I think there's lots of names for that, right? And so I think if you're willing to be part of the solution and coming up with ideas and ways that actually help to connect to the strategy, sometimes also the idea is not connected to what your executive leader or your executive team is talking about what's most important. And so if you can find that alignment between what's most important and then connect the dots to that issue that you're having, you're going to have a greater likelihood of success of getting the support you need.
I like that. I love the incremental piece too. You don't necessarily have to get the home run, but a bunch of singles add up as well, so that's a good point. Wayne,
Eric, is
go ahead.
Just a quick point, Eric, is as we know, the highest category of turnover occurs in the first 90 days, right? Or less. So we're seeing that. So evaluate your onboarding program, evaluate your mentoring program, evaluate what you're doing for training. And then, what you allow, what is acceptable and unacceptable varies. So we're seeing a lot of differences in organizations saying, well, she's always done it that way, so we allow that to occur, or he's always done it that way. That makes a lot of stressful points for folks that are in that lower category and in that frontline staff. And if you allow that to occur, they're going to see it and they're going to move on. And that's why they move on.
Absolutely. So Wayne, expand on, and Stacy, I'll have you kind of chime in on the same question, but when you think about a good leader, whether you're looking to hire somebody or whether it's someone you work with, and for you, Wayne, I mean, you've got so many folks out there in the fields working with so many different kind of organizations and different leaders. What do you hear what do you believe is the most successful trait that they have? What's most important from a skill set standpoint for good leaders, whether we're talking executive leadership or sort of that mid-level management? What makes organizations work better when it comes to skill sets that these leaders have?
Yeah, you mentioned we work with small not-for-profits all the way up to the large nationals. And so we're seeing folks, and when we bring on folks, a lot of times we've had that interaction or we've worked with them in the past. But I think one of the key components, and I think Stacy even hit on it a little bit earlier, is emotional intelligence. And having that ability to understand, manage your own emotions in positive ways to kind of relieve stress, to communicate effectively, both verbal and written, and to overcome challenges, and then to diffuse any kind of conflicts that are out there. But not everyone can walk into a situation that's not doing well. So the ability to adapt and the ability to analyze is really key. So I think just having that emotional intelligence to be able to adapt to situations and then react appropriately and pivot appropriately is key. Stace, I think
same question. Yeah.
Thoughts.
Yeah. So I'll add on to that. A lot of times I've heard also the phrase emotional agility. I think Susan David talked a lot, she's talking a lot and creating a conversation around not only the intelligence, but then how are you being agile with that? And so I'd also add that that's that learning agility. We are in extremely dynamic and disruptive times in healthcare. And so having a leader that is able to be agile with the changing environments, both internal and external. And I would add, in addition to that learning agility, is also self-awareness. That kind of is that, I would say the connection between learning agility and emotional agility is also that self-awareness. And if you have that triad, you're going to have a leader that is going to be able to not only synthesize the team that they're reporting or over, but they're also going to be able to respond in a way that improves the culture of the team moving forward in these really dynamic times.
That's good. I'll add just my 2 cents. Folks, I mean, I think communication, the ability to communicate really clearly, Wayne, you touched on it, but that just standing on its own, being a really great communicator, I think from a leadership standpoint, that doesn't mean you know everything. It just means you're able to convey messages across appropriately to your team. You never leave them wondering, where are things at? It's often said, I heard somebody say one time, and I believe it's true, that if you think about an organization from top to bottom, and you think about the CEO knows everything that's going on. And it could be owner or whatever, administrator, whatever the right word. They know everything that's going on within the organization, right? And if they don't communicate properly, that next layer down knows most of the things going on, right? Maybe at that VP level. And if they don't communicate properly and you go down another level, that mid-level manager knows some of the things going on. And if you get all the way down that front line, they hardly know anything. And so if you're an organization that really thrives on good communication, and you as a leader, make that effort to be an amazing communicator, the whole organization can be really in tune with what you're trying to accomplish and really feel like you know what's going on. I think that's really important. People tell us all the time when they're coming to us as a candidate and we ask them, why do you want to leave? And they're like, look, I don't feel like I belong. I don't know what's going on. I'm not kept in it. So it's that communication, I think, is a big piece as well. Stacy, what about internal talent that you have and your ability to develop them as the next level up leaders? How important is that in today's industry? Because, I could tell you as someone who's worked in the recruiting and search world forever, organizations oftentimes look out and say, I just need to find somebody that has this skill set already and is proven. But as you know, there's not enough talent to go around. So I guess 2 questions is that something you focused on a lot? How important is that? And 2, how do you find time to do that when you as that next level up leader are already spread so thin?
Yeah. Great question. And I think sometimes we learn from our greatest failures, right? So
yeah,
we'll say definitely times where I was absolutely spread too thin, knew that I needed to be able to invest more in my people and needed to find actually how to create that to be a reality. And so for everyone on this call, if you're sitting in the seat and you're like, I absolutely know what we're talking about is important, but I'm way overwhelmed, then I think recognizing it is the first step. But then actually developing strategies. And so to answer your question, you do have to make it as in terms of a priority. If you're leading a people first organization, or you say that people are your greatest asset or your resource, then you need to look at your calendar and you need to see actually how is that being reflected and how intentional am I as a leader in meeting with my people, and not just meeting for meeting's sake, because you can have one-on-ones in your calendar that are on repeat, but the content of those one-on-ones does not actually lead to professional development. And so one of my favorite things to do in a one-on-one is to ask, what are your professional growth goals? What are you looking to grow in? And how can I as a leader to do that and actually protect time? I, as a leader, would say, reach out to me anytime, give me a text message, put yourself on my calendar. I always want to be available to you. But these specific one-on-ones are for us to talk about the things that are not the crisis of the day, that are not the emergency. We want to create protected time to talk about your professional development and help to support in that. So I think it's creating it to be a priority, setting time aside for it, and then setting the expectation. We want to have you grow. I think it's important as you look at your career ladders to look at, how do you also help to support, because not everybody wants to level up, like, for example, go from a manager to a vice president. Right. But how can you create tiers within the management level where people can, and individuals can stay in their sweet spot, but you can create advancement within that level and additional responsibility. So I think it's important to look at both lateral growth and to retain, because I think you had a great stat in your initial slide deck. I mean, it's expensive to replace someone. So how can you create that growth within the role or expanded role, but also create a really clear what you need to support to get them to the next level? And then help to sponsor individuals, especially diverse individuals within your organization, is absolutely key. And there is a strategy, not just to mentorship, but to specific sponsorship.
Yeah. Did you get a lot of pushback from your team or from, maybe executive leadership from the system or what, when you're trying to protect that time and spend X% of your time working on professional development and everybody's spread so thin? Did you get a lot of pushback from whether it was your managers that you're asking to do this or folks above you, if you will?
No, I didn't get pushback. I think
was it hard to honor those times?
Well, yeah, so that's the thing. I think the pushback was actually internal, not external. Yeah. So I think that's where, it's always, you can do the one more thing. And I think you have to radically prioritize. You cannot get every single initiative done at once. And so I think that as an executive leader, you have to become even better at communicating what you can do realistically with limited resources and bandwidth, prioritize those things and bring in external support when needed, if there is something that's so critical you don't have resources to do. And that could be either in terms of, interim management, or it can be other consulting services or resources from across or cross-functional organizations that will help you to meet that need. But I think it's also in how you do it. So you're already spending time with people. If you spend proactive time with people, it's going to pay off in the long term. And so I think I did that a lot in my leadership in terms of what we talked about at the beginning of the day. how we actually met in our morning huddles and what we talked about, so that everything that we needed to in terms of escalating what was important, the resources that were needed, if there's a safety concern, who needed help that day was covered. So then later in the day, there was less crisis interruptions, fires, so that I had more of the protected time to have those conversations that mattered. So I think it's a systems approach, but it's an intentionality, and it starts with the leader. So I
Yeah.
think the biggest challenge I had was myself.
So Wayne, and again, both of you all want to chime in on this. As you're thinking about building a really great team, you're going to have to bring people. It's not always that can promote from within. I get it. You're growing. You got to hire new people, or maybe you just don't have that bench strength. So Wayne, as you're interviewing somebody, and looking back at your years as an operator, or talking to our interims and whatnot, what are some best practices, if you will, around interviewing techniques to really ensure someone is who they say they are?
Yeah, we do a lot of work because, as you know, the talent management team, we get a lot of resumes, and you look at a resume and it could look fantastic on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the whole thing. And then once you get them on a call, and we like to do a couple of calls. One, we'd like to do, an initial discovery call, and then we do a face-to-face through, nowadays we can utilize these resources right here. So those tactics and looking at the whole person, okay, the whole person meaning, what are their hobbies? What do they like to do? How do they interact with people? Tell me a story of one of your best practices. But we also do the background checks. We actually want to make sure that they are what they say they are. And we do, give me a relationship that you had, not through work. Give me some relationship that you had at work. And we like to see cross lines across multiple certain disciplines. Clinical will give you a clinical resource. Finance will give you a finance resource, and we understand that they have to know what they're talking about, but we also do a data assessment. So when we talk about KPIs, drill into that data assessment. Tell me what the KPI, why are you looking at it? What's the impact of that? Being an operator myself helps me a little bit. I was in the past running and operating, but that was the way that we really do both passive and active looking at talent. But by getting folks that we've worked with in the past, that's an easier way of doing it. So bringing on talent that you already know is a real good operator is always the best way.
Yeah, Stacy, what was your best practice?
Yeah, I think identifying those critical traits that you need in the position. So, and it can be different based on where the team is at, the other leaders that you've hired within the organization. And so I think highlighting what are those traits and characteristics and skill sets that you need for this specific position for this specific time. There are amazing leaders across, sectors, but you are most likely looking for a leader that lives in those specifics. And so I think writing those things down and getting that clear within your interview team, and then specifically crafting questions that are based on the behavioral interviewing style. So tell me a time when blank, tell me what you did, and then how it turned out. And so I think having the candidate give you very specific examples is 100 times better, a little Tony, what you mentioned, than just a generic, how would you approach a situation? So whenever possible, using that behavioral, and then allowing that then answer to kind of, you can ask some follow-up questions to really deeper dive to understand that person's overall skill set, but also preferences.
Another thing too, Eric,
go ahead.
Stacy talked about some of the tactics, whether it's morning huddle, and you ask them how they managed people and what was successful. There's an old term, management by walking around, where you literally would sit down right next to somebody and talk to them. How's your day going? What's happening? What's causing you to struggle right now? And that management style, I think, is always helpful by just getting that leader to work all the way through the process so that they understand the process. And Stacy, I know you did that all the time.
All the time, yeah. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do. So I always make time for it. I think it's important to know too that so for example, like with learning agility, there's very specific questions that you can ask to get at learning agility. And so I think, again, highlighting those traits, have of course the absolute basic interview questions it should be, and absolutely should be standard, but customizing some questions that specifically get at those traits that you're looking at. I've learned tons and been able to better differentiate candidates when I ask very specific questions. Here's a good example. Tell me a time when you had a situation that you've encountered in a prior organization or within your current organization, and you had a tried and true method that you were able to implement and do before. Tell me about a time when you saw the same problem implemented the solution, but it didn't turn out the same way. Tell me about it, and what do you do? That will
right.
tell me whether or not, if they're going to come into a different organization and it's going to be a different culture or a different environment. It's going to tell me how they approach it. And so, or how they deal with failure, or if they have what level of their growth mindset. And so I think that's where, think about asking specific questions for those traits that you're looking for.
These are great points. I'll add just a couple other things that aren't really, maybe just a little bit pivoting different, is as you're thinking about going through an interview process, we have a saying here in our talent solutions team that time kills all deals. And so when you do find that talent that's really that's really good, and it's lining up, as Stacy says, those characteristics, know that you need to move quickly. And I know that can be difficult in very complicated, complex organizations, but it's such a competition for the top talent now that if that person's interviewing with you, they're probably interviewing with 2 or 3 other organizations. And that old saying of early bird gets the worm is absolutely true when you're dealing with a top candidate that's out there. And it doesn't mean you sacrifice your diligence. It just means that you move the process along as quickly as possible, and you don't put unnecessary steps into the process to get to an endpoint where you would be offering someone a job. And then the last piece I'll say, well, Wayne touched on references first off, and I love that, Wayne, because too often we do employment verifications and think that that's a reference. That's not a reference. It's just, did somebody work here or not? Really digging in on references to get a feel for what someone has accomplished in their past is great. And the last piece is interviewing for cultural fit. Stacy talked about, and it's true, making sure the characteristics are there. But part of the characteristics is, are you a good fit with the team? It's so expensive to replace people. And there's really great talent out there that, yes, they have the skill sets and those characteristics to be successful, but if they're not a good cultural fit with the organization, it's going to do more harm than good. They might really know what they're doing, but just not fit with your team. You need to determine that before you move forward with the candidate. Because of where we are in this industry with this small talent pool of good folks, we're really quick to move forward with anybody that has a pulse that seems to be credentialed, right? But it's so expensive to replace, and just make sure they're a good cultural fit as well. And, kind of gets me, well, we'll hold the cultural piece, but I want to talk a little bit about some creative things, Stacy, as you think about, ways that you can move the needle when you're talking about improving the experience your employees have, or just creative ways of getting around workforce shortages and making your life as a leader easier. I mean, anything come to mind as far as just being creative and doing things kind of differently?
Yeah. My specialty area.
Yeah, I know.
So my brain's just going with, I'll limit it to a few key ideas. I think one of the things that is most important when you're thinking about, workforce shortages, how to do things differently, is really about identifying what can you alone do? What is unique? What can you not delegate? So here's a great example. I was talking with an executive leader earlier today, and she had brought on, she had leadership vacancies. She had brought on some other new leaders, and was saying, I can't even get to my own strategic work as a chief officer because I am just I'm trying to help everyone. I'm trying to do everything. And so I think being creative sometimes looks at, what can you uniquely do? What do you need to uniquely do? Only you can do. And sometimes that's like the communication. Sometimes that's setting the strategic direction. And then what resources can I bring in to help to support either my team or my organization? And so sometimes that looks like bringing in, if you have a vacancy, that looks like bringing in some interim management. If you have a brand new leader, it looks like engaging others to help to support with what's needed. Maybe that's educational resources. Maybe that's a coach and a mentor. Maybe that's, conferences or other types of support that are helping to do training. So I think you have to look at what are you trying to do that you can engage others. The export outsourcing is extremely key when there's limited resources and time. But you as the executive or you as the leader, there are things that you absolutely cannot delegate. I think that's super key. I think something else that you have to remember is that we all are human beings. We're not human doers.
Yeah.
And so you'll never go wrong by saying, what do I need to do today so that I demonstrate first, because people don't care what you know until they know that you care.
Correct.
And so how am I today communicating to my team, or doing rounds with my team, or being my leaders in a way that they know that they belong, that they're cared for, and I am helping with psychological safety. Because if you do not have trust in your organization, it doesn't matter what creative idea that you have, it's not happening. And so I think looking at those key areas and focusing on the people element and the human element, and then seeing what you can do from there to help to generate then the ideas coming up from your team, and making sure that you as a leader, again, aren't trying to do it all. Like, if you're feeling like you're trying to do it all and you're spread too thin, what resources do you have in your team? What development is there? And then who do you need to export outsource to? I think are all absolutely key to helping to navigate in dynamic world of healthcare right now.
Yeah, it's that's great. I mean, Wayne, obviously your team's doing that on a regular basis. I mean, as far as trying to help these leaders, move the needle and get to where they're trying to go with whatever initiative it is, we're just plugging holes. But do you hear things from them as far as the creative things that they're doing to ease these workforce challenges or to help develop people and whatnot? I mean, what's your team telling you as you're having the conversations with all these leaders that are out in the field on the ground doing the work?
Well, I have to applaud Stacy, and I always have it. The first hurdle is recognizing there's a void, right? I can't do it all. I don't have the talent. I need help on this factor. And I think that's key. What we're trying to do is help stabilization always, right? That's a key component of what we do. And we bring in what we call focused resources. And Stacy, for example, brought in a couple of folks that were focused on specific items, specific goals, specific expectations, and get the job done, move it on so that they can move forward and move through a hurdle that they were having. So our folks come in, I think what they're good at is assessing, evaluating, and then implementing, and in that very order, because they can't just come in and say, I know what I'm doing, you guys got to listen to me. It's not a good consultant. And that's, no one wants to be told how and what they've done wrong. They want to be told how and what they can do better, and then move on from there. We're not replacing resources. We're expanding and enhancing resources. So that's what I think our folks do. They do a really good job of assessing and then implementing and then moving on. Our folks, I think, like to do that. Some folks like to be parachute jumpers and help and then move on to the next project. So we've got a pretty talented bench that does that, but they've got good traits that can allow them to do that and be successful. Because if we're not successful, our clients aren't successful.
Yeah. I'll add too, as you're thinking about kind of the creative ways to make a difference when you think about workforce shortage. What I'm hearing from folks is kind of two things. One, we know work-life balance is just so important, and it's so hard to achieve in what we're doing today. But as leadership and the way we do things, I mean, there's some organizations out there doing some creative things around work-life balance. And, one, you should be looking at what technologies you're leveraging and how that can make a professional's life a little bit easier. Any aspect of your day-to-day. How can we make this a little bit easier for our staff? How can we give them more resources and tools to make their lives easier? Because it's such a big deal. If you can get creative there, as opposed to being reactive and saying, oh, I see this organization doing that, I'll do that too. What if you're the first one to decide to do that? It makes a big difference. The other thing is just to think about the way you compensate your staff. I have had when you're thinking about getting people interested in working for you, how can you do different things related to incentive comp? Aligning goals to get to the proper outcome, but giving folks upside if the organization experiences upside. You want to talk about getting alignment, right? I mean, we always say money's not everything. It's not, but I'm betting everybody on this call isn't working for free. So it's something, it's meaningful. It always comes up as one of the top 2 or 3 reasons why someone will move jobs. But in the past 12 months, I've seen more and more organizations develop creative incentive compensation plans for their team than I ever had before. And I'm not just talking about C-suite executives or managers. I'm talking about even, rank and file frontline staff. I just think that's a creative thing that you might look to see what you can do to help them participate in the upside, right? And get them excited and separate yourself from the other organizations out there.
Hey, Eric, just a couple of examples you mentioned about being creative. Up here in the Northeast, we have a limited summertime, right? So our middle managers get very stressed when they can't take that week off to go to Cape Cod or go up to Maine. I have one organization that gets very creative and in the summer brings on support staff so that when folks come back to their job, they don't have a backlog of things that they have to get through. They can start their day on a normal basis, and they're allowed to take that time off. Another example is an organization that did have a backlog, brought in some interim support staff to get them caught up, change process, and then allow them to improve, so they didn't have that retention or loss factor that they would have if they allowed that to occur. So good support ideas besides compensation, Eric, which I know is important.
No, that's good.
I'll also add in too that sometimes you have to evaluate when you might be killing an idea that is creative or innovative. And here's a really good example. We can't take new graduates into home health or hospice. They have to have experience first. Okay, well, what would you need to make that happen? We can't pull our case managers off the weekends. Everyone has to take call. Right. So if you say, always, never, I think it's always a good opportunity to look, can there be a creative solution? And do you have the resources within your own team to be able to do that? Or do you need to engage others, right? Either others from other organizations or expert outsource to actually help to implement, whether it be a creative compensation strategy, staffing strategy, new grad development program, or maybe you have an existing leader who is a fantastic leader, but has never been in home care. You say, well, so maybe the creative thing to do is look at how you can bring them over and partner with others who have experience to be able to do that, right? So I think that's, always identify if you're to get to that creative zone. Sometimes you have to identify what are the assumptions that you're making that you cannot do something. And maybe it's because you do have limited resources, but you have to expand about what would it take to be able to make that easy.
Absolutely. So I want to respect our time. We're trying to kind of close up by a quarter till, and then maybe save a few minutes for questions. But Stacy, you've always had a really good culture about you. You've always really appreciated the people part of our industry, and I think you've always recognized how important that is to both attracting really good talent as you're trying to build a team and retaining talent as you're trying to build a team. So curious, listen, we could talk about culture for hours and hours and hours, but if you were going to share a few things, maybe a couple tips or ideas that you have about what helps when you're trying to build that positive culture within an organization, where do you start? What's a leader to do? What's a couple thoughts or ideas that you could share?
Yeah, I always say that number one, you absolutely have to have an aligned leadership team. You as an executive leader, so me, leading an organization as the CEO or the CNO could absolutely not take and actually translate the culture all the way to the front line, no matter how hard I tried.
Right.
You have to have your leaders, your next level leaders and the next leaders after that, absolutely engaged and aligned to be able to actually demonstrate activities. And I will tell you that one of the most important things that you can do from a leadership perspective is actually measure the behavior. So when you gave a great example earlier about rounding and intentional rounding, and rounding is not just like, hey, how was the game last night? Rounding is, how are you? What's getting in your way? Who can I celebrate? Who's done a great job, right? Is it creating that virtuous cycle? And so how are you measuring then the intentional rounding, both qualitatively and quantitatively? If you as a leader can measure those behaviors, you will absolutely drive your culture. So I would say that that's probably the most important thing. And then you also have to model it, right? Like we talked about before, like you have to lead it and you model it. But as a leadership team, you have to measure not just the outcomes, the behaviors.
And Wayne, I know you've been in many different organizations that have different cultures. And folks, if you have a question for Stacy or Wayne or whoever, the Q&A section right there, you can click on that. You can add it in. We'll look at that right when we're done here in just a couple of minutes. So fire away. But Wayne, you've seen a number of different organizations, the big for public or for profits, the non-for-profits, the SimiTree of the world. What do you see as far as things that matter most or move the needle when you're trying to build a really good culture?
It's not what you say, it's how you say it, which is always a thing that my mom taught me a long time ago. Praise good deeds, recognize success, and reward success too. I think you said, earlier, that there's 5 different levels: millennials, Gen Z, boomers. We've got so many different types of folks that like different compensation, recognition. So I think the other thing that I started to allude to very earlier is that what you allow becomes your culture. So if you have a culture of accountability, I think that's a good thing. People like accountability. If you have a culture of empathy, that's a good thing too. We're in healthcare. We are empathetic. If you have a culture where you challenge somebody on, we can't do that. Well, why can't we? So that's always things. You build that culture through your own personal leadership. And I think that's really important. And you allow your managers to do the same thing. So you give them the ability to do the same thing. And I think that's really important. Don't limit their capabilities and successes.
I'll add to that. That's awesome. Is that in all the years that I've been recruiting for organizations and working with clients to find good talent and whatnot, and as you're looking at cultures and understanding what that organization's culture looks like, I can tell you I've never found an organization that I believe has a really great culture that didn't have a lot of positivity flowing through it. Meaning when there's a challenge, that leader still looks from the glass half full, right? I mean, every organization has different cultures. No two cultures that are the same. What's right for me might not be right for Stacy. However, what's a common thread of good, positive companies out there? And if you read the books like Good to Great, it's the positivity, that mentality that is a core fundamental of having a great culture. And so if there's one little tip I'd give is, even if life isn't going well, man, just put on a smiling face and be positive about the future outlook as far as that goes. So, well, we're basically at time. Missy, I don't know if there's questions in the Q&A section or not, but I'll give you guys just a moment again to chime in if there is a question. We appreciate you being here today. I think this is a conversation that we could probably talk about for 2-3 hours minimum. But again, hopefully we've shared some basic ideas for you guys. So Missy, I see this question here. Yeah. So when you reward employees for desired traits behavior, do you recommend doing it publicly or privately? And Stacy, I think this would be a good one for you to take.
Whenever possible, actually asking and knowing the preference of your individual teams. There are software, systems and technology that can help you do that. But if on a personal level, you actually know whether or not it should be public or private, that is absolutely the best. So when it can be personalized to that individual and specific, right? It doesn't help to say, hey, everybody, good job. We're so awesome. But can you point out those behaviors, or even especially attaching those that recognition directly to your organization's values or mission, or what's important to that individual? Then you've really hit the sweet spot. So if you can always probably default in private is probably better, and then ask in private if can I share this publicly? If I would say that if you don't know, that's probably the best default mode. And I will tell you that don't also underestimate like a handwritten note. I'd walk down the office and a note that I gave somebody a year ago is still hanging on their cube. I didn't think anything of it. Just wrote down a quick note, passed it to them, and just said, thank you, I appreciate you. Like, to me, it was 60 seconds of just a moment of gratitude. They hung it on their wall for years. And so never underestimate the small tokens. It doesn't have to be big and grandiose. It can be extremely small.
We have a little thing that we do here at SimiTree that is called Kudos. And it's on our kind of internal online app. But, if Wayne it knocks it out of the park on something and one of our team, is benefited by that person could say, hey, Wayne, thanks for the help today with XYZ proposal or whatnot. It just goes, but it's on like a little chat board, just kudos. And it's everybody kind of puff your chest out a little bit and feel good about yourself when you get that unsolicited kudos from your teammates, which I think is really good. But no, that's a good point, Stacy. So another question, what types of questions do you ask in your discovery calls to know how to move forward with a second level touch point with an applicant? So I think this is kind of getting to, what your buying signs, or even Stacy, maybe maybe you can look at that. When do you say, heck no, I'm out of this one, but what kind of questions are you looking at, Stacy?
It's interesting. So I think it was part of my discovery call. I also believe in 100% transparency. So I'll actually start the call out with, what is exactly going on and what we're looking for. And what I'm looking for the candidate is to actually respond in a way that actually connects to what I'm sharing in terms of what I'm looking for, why I'm looking for them. Again, getting to that fit that you mentioned before, Eric. And then asking a few key questions about what maybe some key areas that I'm really looking for. So I might ask some very specific leadership questions that are very pointed to kind of get me an understanding of that individual before I would move forward. So I think that's generally how I handled my discovery calls. And overall, like straight, really transparent, what we're looking for and why. And then there's some key questions that are, again, behavioral based to get at those, just a handful of them. And then I'm looking for that response, that engagement.
That's, and just coming from a recruiter standpoint, who's, unfortunately, I've probably interviewed tens of thousands of people now in the past 20 years. And it can get mundane, right? If you're doing it all the time. And so the way that I've sort of flowed into this, and maybe I've talked to one of you guys in the past, but I always start off, to your point, Stacy, saying, let me tell you a little bit about, me, what I'm doing, and what this search that I'm working on. I'll give you a couple minutes on this from a high level. And then why don't you take a few minutes and just walk me through your career to where you've gotten to today? One thing I'll tell you, and this is a good thing, and Stacy, I probably had this conversation with you at one point, it's never a 2-minute conversation. You share a little bit about what you're doing, and then you ask that candidate, tell me how you got to where you are in your career today, and just expand on that. You just sit back and take notes. And most folks in our space will talk about all the good things they've done, and they'll share more than maybe you would have even gotten if you asked specific questions. And then there's lots of just opportunities to follow up on that. It ends up being a 15-minute conversation with the first question. And so I think that's a good way to start.
I like when a candidate closes. I'm going to be honest with you. We've got certain questions that we want to get through and when a candidate starts asking the most appropriate questions and says, tell me what your goals are and how I can help you achieve those goals, for example. And it's okay. That's an engaged candidate and wants to make sure that they're doing the right tactics to get to the successful implementation. So I don't mind when they start closing, honestly. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions right now at the moment, but again, as Missy said, in the handout that she sent you or is in the chat, all three of our email addresses, Wayne, Stacy, and I, are there. I would also encourage you guys, follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already. Connect with us. I know myself personally, I put out a lot of stuff related to workforce and development. Stacy does the same thing. We all work in this industry and love to chat workforce. So if there's questions you have afterwards, reach out to any one of us. Happy to help. But we want to thank you for joining us today and wish you the best with the remainder of the week. Thank you, everybody.
Great panel discussion. Thank you guys for joining us. As Eric said, we will follow up sending out a recording of the webinar and the handout to your email. So thanks again for joining SimiTree.
One other thing, Missy, we're also going to be sending you kind of a takeaways document that has a lot of best practices that should be ready for prime time maybe tomorrow. It's going to be based on a lot of the conversation today. We'll send that to you via email, so be on the lookout for it as well.
Excellent. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much, Eric, Stacy, and Wayne. Great discussion.
Thanks, guys. Bye.